So in the last two videos, we talked about the effect of the way humans grow food on the environment and suggested some ways that maybe it could be done more sustainably. Using polycultures instead of monocultures, using more crop rotation to make sure that the nutrients are being returned to the soil in ways that are not easily washed out, which with artificial fertilizers, they're more easily washed out of the soil. Switching our dietary focus to a more plant-based diet as opposed to a more meat-based diet, or at least decreasing the amount of beef involved in the meat-based diet. And the way that we do agriculture contributes to habitat destruction, which is a larger concept, which includes, yes, agriculture. And one of the big ways that we clear space for agriculture is actually by setting fire to large sections of forest. Not in the United States. This is not something that's currently happening in the United States, setting sections of forest on fire to clear for farmland. But in the Amazon rainforest, this absolutely is happening, and in Sumatra in particular. There's people who come in and set fire to large sections of the rainforest, burn it down in order to create more space available that could then be converted over to tillable land, usually to set up palm oil plantations or space for cattle grazing or for growing vegetables to then feed to cattle. So again, agriculture is one of the largest driving factors of habitat destruction. Palm oil is you grow it on a tree, you get these large palm fruits, and you can create this oil from it, which goes into lots and lots and lots of different products. It shows up in detergents like laundry detergent and dish detergent. It shows up in cosmetics. It shows up in snack foods like Cheetos and Doritos and those kind of things. It is just a very, very cheap lipid, a cheap oil that you can utilize, and it's grown in these monocultures on land that used to be rainforest, and large sections of territory are cleared out for this purpose. I think I'll have a section later on, or we may have a video where we look more at palm oil plantations. Urban development is another driving factor for habitat destruction. This is where we build cities, but once you build the city, as the population increases, you start to get the city starts filling up, right? And you need more people to do more jobs inside that city. So it gets over capacity, and you start having people that want to be able to live in a more suburban lifestyle, a little bit closer to a rural lifestyle. They don't want to live in the noisy city and all that, all the lights and all that. They want to be able to move out of the city, but still be in commuting distance. So you get a suburban area built up around the city. And as the population continues to increase, the suburbs around a city will grow and grow and grow. It's called suburban sprawl. The nice thing about cities is that you can have apartments stacked on top of each other. They're built vertically. So you could have the footprint of one apartment, but in a building that's 30 stories tall. So you have 30 apartments stacked up on top of each other. In terms of space usage, right, that's only taking up the space of one apartment, but there's 30 apartments that are stacked up on top of each other. But the suburbs, each family has their own plot of land. So as the population spills out of the city, you get much, much, much more land usage as the suburbs keep getting developed and keep growing. So where does that land usage come from? Well, it usually comes from filling in wetlands and clearing out large sections of forest in order to keep up with the demand. Another force for habitat destruction is forestry, and forestry is the usage of trees for lumber and construction. So a lot of cutting down trees, obviously, for getting lumber. Mining is another big driving factor of habitat destruction. So what you have here is a mountaintop, and they're mining it for seams of coal. Back in the day, like way back, you think of like Pennsylvania history, we're a big coal mining state. You would dig a tunnel and go into a mountainside, and the coal is in seams. It's in compressed layers that might be at strange angles. It might be at like diagonal angles to the level of the land. So you build your mine shaft in such a way that it's going to follow that seam of coal, and then you get your coal miners to dig out the coal from that seam as you go. And you build these tunnels branching out and branching out underground in order to try to maximize how much coal you're able to get out of that seam. But on the surface, you actually don't have that much of an impact because you've just built a little hole and then you're going underground. You do have some impact. Obviously, there's a large operation outside, bringing carts of coal out and getting the trucks loaded up, and you have to build roads in and out of there, and there's heavy equipment, and you need a house to hold all the dynamite that you're bringing in to blast the seams of coal, all that kind of thing. But nowadays, that kind of coal mining is way less common. It is substantially more efficient for a coal mining company to purchase the rights to a plot of land, frequently from a government, so it would be public land that is then purchased by a private company, loss of natural capital, and then they use large machines to strip away layer by layer the mountainside, so they can get the entire seam of coal this way, but also the entire mountainside is gone. The entire landscape is going to be destroyed and disrupted. All of the plant life, all of the animal life, all the fungus, everything in that ecosystem is going away in order to get the coal that's underneath. And that's just in the obtaining of the coal. That has nothing to do with the pollution that's generated from metal mines. Gold mines in particular generate a lot of pollution, or from, say, burning the coal after it's been obtained, which also generates a lot of air pollution. As a consequence of mountaintop removal being the most common kind of coal mining nowadays, you can clear a mountaintop with a much smaller group of people. You can get these big machines and a specialized crew that is able to do that, much smaller number of workers. And this is the primary reason why coal jobs in the United States have been shrinking over time. That and competition from natural gas, which has become cheaper over time due to technologies like fracking. So if you hear politicians saying that coal mining jobs in the United States are disappearing, that's true. That is a fact. But the reason is not to do with regulation or any of these other kinds of factors. It's because we don't need coal miners in the same way that we used to. And the demand for coal has been decreasing over time. And coal is actually the most polluting form of energy, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the energy chapter. So that's probably a good thing, except that there are towns in the United States whose entire economy is reliant on coal mining. And that's not a trivial consideration. But we'll talk more about that later on. Much like in ecology, how every element of an ecosystem is connected to every other, you can't remove anything without affecting 10 other things in the ecosystem, economics is kind of like that as well. And you can see kind of the connection between these two things. In fact, they both start with eco in the name, which is derived from the Greek word oikos, which refers to family, but more like the household of a family and the prosperity and wealth of that family. So the connections, the interconnections of different members of the family and the way that they interact with the world around them in order to adapt and survive and prosper. And you can see the connection between economics and ecology to that kind of core metaphorical concept. I don't know, I think that stuff's cool. Let's move on to the next slide. This is a satellite photo of a section of the Amazon rainforest called Rondônia, which in 1975 was entirely forest. This is in Brazil. You can see it's 100% green here. This is in 2001 right here. You can see all of the habitat destruction that's gone through. It's been kind of eaten away. And the reason why it has this pattern to it is because the way humans travel, we need to build roads to go through things. So you'll build a road to get from point A to point B, and then the habitat destruction will branch off from that road, right? You'll build cities or houses or businesses or things like that off that. So you get these really interesting line patterns popping up. But nevertheless, you still get all of this habitat destruction. And then, let's see here. Looks like I provided myself a Google Earth link. Brazil. And you can see how massive, you see all of this light green has that same pattern. So this whole section of the rainforest has been cleared for urban development, for agriculture, for palm oil plantations, for all kinds of human purposes. And if you look around, you can actually see, yeah, look at this, how much of the Amazon rainforest has been cleared for human usage. The same kinds of line patterns popping up all over. Now, this is a problem of global concern. First, the Amazon rainforest is one of the most biodiverse habitats on the planet. So in terms of global biodiversity, considering the biosphere as one massive ecosystem and knowing that high biodiversity means high resilience. So any kind of disaster that comes through, the more species, the more genetic diversity, the more ecosystem diversity that we have, the more resilient as a planet we're going to be. The loss of the Amazon rainforest is a big hit to overall biodiversity, which also means the loss of potential products, medical products, and other types of commercial products that we could potentially get from many organisms that live in that Amazon rainforest, many of which we have never discovered. We're discovering new species in the Amazon all the time. Think back to the cone snails we talked about with coral reefs. But another major concern is that as a massive, massive forest, all of that photosynthesis that is conducted by the plants in the Amazon rainforest, photosynthesis pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It has the effect of mitigating the effects of climate change. As we continue to add more and more carbon to the atmosphere, the photosynthesis in the rainforest pulls it back out. It's one of the things slowing down the rate of climate change, slowing down the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. The loss of rainforest means that the photosynthetic effect is decreasing worldwide, right? This is the biggest forest that we have, and it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So you can see on this next slide the annual loss of rainforest over time, over a couple decades here, and it was at its peak in 1995, slowed down a little bit, then it got back to its peak in about 2005, and then it's actually been going down and down and down, and then you see a little uptick here at the end. And then if you look at the cumulative loss, so okay, slowing down, that sounds good, but it's never gone down to zero. So if you take a look at the cumulative loss on the right-hand side, the yellow graph, you could see that, yeah, it's pretty much been marching upward, how much loss of rainforest we've had in terms of square miles since the 1990s, well, since the 1970s, honestly. We've been cutting it down and cutting it down and cutting it down. This gentleman that I have a picture of down here, this is President Bolsonaro, president of Brazil, and part of his main campaign has been to take what he perceives as a very economically unproductive portion of Brazil, large chunk of Brazil is Amazon rainforest. I mean, obviously the Amazon rainforest is bigger than Brazil, but what he considers to be economically unproductive territory, the rainforest, and harvest as much material and natural resources from it as possible, with no concern for sustainability, for being able to utilize more resources going on into the future. And as we discussed earlier, that might not be the economically best approach. You can pull as many resources out of your area as possible, but if then it cannot regrow fast enough to match your rate of consumption, you're going to lose all of that production, and then at some point down the line, it's just gone, and you don't have anything else. Removing materials in a sustainable pace is the better long-term economic strategy. Not to mention that with the loss of the Amazon rainforest, you also lose all of those economic services, ecosystem services that we discussed way back in chapter 1 and 2, all of the amenities provided by healthy ecosystems in terms of water purification, climate change mitigation, the food, the biodiversity, the pest control services, all these things that healthy ecosystems will provide to you without you needing to pay more money for infrastructure. So under his presidency, the destruction of the rainforest has been ticking up, and that's what you start to see here at the end in this graph. And I have click for article here, and this is an article now from it should be 2021, right? Yeah, 2021. And it notes that deforestation in Brazil has actually hit a 15-year high at that point. So it is now at the highest point that it's ever been. And in fact, as you cut down trees, and the trees are decomposing, right? And you cut down vegetation, it's decomposing. You are generating more CO2. The leaves have to rot, right? And as they rot, they release CO2. Now the Amazon rainforest is at a point where it is releasing more CO2 than it is capable of absorbing. So it's no longer a carbon sink, it is now a carbon source for the atmosphere. That is profoundly bad news. This research comes from Brazil's National Institute for Space Research, the former head of which Bolsonaro actually fired for publishing data that indicated that there had been a massive increase in forest fires over the past couple of years. However, Bolsonaro has, within the past year, signed an agreement called COP26, which pledges to end deforestation by 2030. Now, that is entirely antithetical to his behavior in office up until this point. So we will see. We'll see what happens. So back to the slide, I have here that forests are suffering from habitat destruction, habitat degradation, and habitat fragmentation. 3 different concepts. Habitat destruction, probably the easiest one to understand. We destroyed it. It's gone, right? Whether from development or forest fires or whatever it is, it's just been blown away. It's gone. Habitat degradation is when the ecosystem is impaired in some way, but organisms are still able to use it. It's just lower quality than it was before. Pollution can cause habitat degradation, right? The plants and animals are still there. They're still an ecosystem, but it's less healthy than it was before. Smog, right, coming through. Road salts coming in, right? These are both pollution. Noise, traffic noise from a road nearby, that can contribute to habitat degradation. Animals are going to behave differently if there's constantly car horns and noise in an area than they would if it was totally silent. So that alters the way that organisms behave in that particular environment. Habitat fragmentation is something you see a lot in suburban areas. It's when you build roads and you build suburban areas and developments and all that, but you leave these little patches of forest. If you ever look at like satellite photos of suburban areas, you see these little patches of forest. They're not very big. You could just like walk through them in a few minutes. They're not like parks. They're just areas that never got developed at all. They just kind of were left behind. Maybe they're technically owned by some homeowners association, but they can't build on it for one reason or another, so the forest just got left behind. And they just kind of pop up all over the place. So that's a place where you could have, say, like deer and foxes and other trees and ground cover plants and all kinds of ecosystem components interacting together, but they're fragmented. They used to have the entire landscape to be able to utilize. Maybe they have a water source way over here. Maybe there's a really good food source way over here. Maybe this is a really good place for hiding or bunkering down over the winter. But all of those different elements of what used to be contiguous territory, connected territory, have now been fragmented from each other. So in order to go from one location, one little cluster of forest, to another cluster of forest, they have to traverse the more dangerous sections of urban territory or suburban territory, which contains roads and people and cars and that sort of thing, which in these terms we refer to as the matrix. The matrix is a space in between the natural settings. If you've ever been in your car and you get upset because there's a herd of deer running across the road, remember that the forest was there first, and then we built a road going through the forest. They are just crossing from getting from one part of their territory to the other part of the territory. We're the ones that split the forest into two halves. So habitat fragmentation can be relatively minor. You can have a big forest and you just kind of build a road going straight through it. Depending on the amount of traffic, that could be a kind of minor disruption to an ecosystem. Or you could have lots of suburban development such that you have these very tiny little patches of forest. And then organisms that are maybe on a migration route might have to cross large sections of matrix in order to be able to go from area to area. And they might not have a very good mechanism for navigating from one area to another. They might not know exactly what direction the next cluster of forest is going to be in. So that means that moving out of one little section of forest is going to be very dangerous for them. So habitat fragmentation and degradation are both forces that also cause decreases in biodiversity because you're going to end up with a lot of dead organisms. Some organisms are going to be better adapted for this than others. Here's another example of habitat degradation. This bird here on the left is the red-cockaded woodpecker, and it requires a habitat with clear flight paths between trees. It kind of flies low in between trees. But when we were in the 1970s and we had this policy of forest fire suppression, no forest fires ever, underbrush like shrubs and other types of plants that grow up at the base of the trees got thicker and thicker and thicker to the point where there were no flight paths available for these woodpeckers. The way they behave said, we need to fly from tree to tree but keep it relatively low, and they were blocked in every direction. So as a result, their population started to dwindle because they just were not able to adapt to this now degraded environment, and degraded because we were suppressing a natural force in this ecosystem, forest fires. Again, this is why we now use selective forest fire management. We will do prescribed burns at one time of the year when we know we can control it, and then we'll leave that section of forest alone for a while, and then we'll burn somewhere else, and we'll do these little burns so they don't add up to some big burn later on. So it suffered from forest fire suppression, increasing the height of vegetation on the forest floor, but then, even though it was nearly extinct, when we changed our forest fire management policies, it recovered. It came back once we started applying controlled burns and other types of management techniques. So it was near extinction, we changed what we were doing, and its population sprang back. Here's this story cracks me up. I'm not sure why it cracks me up so much, but I think it's just hubris. So this is the Kissimmee River, and you can see how on this map, it's in Florida. That's not relevant, but it flows and it has these bends to it. And most rivers do this. They go left and right and left and right, and they curve back and forth like this. And because it kind of goes, wide left and wide right and wide left, it has this big wide floodplain. And, if you want to do a lot of development, you don't want this massive floodplain, you have you want to be able to put houses and stuff in. So they thought, what if we could narrow the floodplain? What if we could control this river? And there's other reasons why you would want to control a river. And they just thought they would try to straighten it out a little bit. So you see this dotted line. This was their new planned route for the river. And they did a massive construction project. They got the Army Corps of Engineers involved. And they dug out a new pathway for the river to take, which was much, much straighter. So it turns out that there's a reason why rivers have bends in them. Every time the water flows into one of these bends, it kind of rams up against the side of the bank and it slows down a little bit, and then it flows to the other side and it slows down, and then it slows to the other side and it slows down, and it keeps the pace of the river at a kind of consistent speed. And if you try to straighten it out, there's no mechanism for the water to slow down. So the speed at which the water was being delivered downstream increased a lot as a result of this construction project. So you had much faster flowing water coming down, and faster flowing water is able to pick up larger particles of dirt and rock and sediment from the bed of the river. So you started to get more and more erosion. The banks of the river started getting eroded away because you have more, and the bottom of the river as well, because it's faster flowing water. It's just picking up all this mud and dirt and sediment along with it. Additionally, the effect of having this wide floodplain means that when the river floods over, when it spills over, it distributes all of the nutrients that it's carrying with it, all the silt and sediment and nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur that's in there, to the ecosystems on either side of this floodplain. We have wetlands on either side here. And what do wetlands do? They store water, they absorb excess nutrients, right? They have this nice ecosystem service for us of accepting additional storm water so that it doesn't end up in our cities. Well, we had removed that, right? We narrowed the floodplain. So all of the water, when you had some sort of storm event, not only is it rushing faster, but we narrowed the channel. So now it's all rushing through this river at once. So you got massive flooding downstream, and not just massive flooding, but muddy flooding, like muddy water coming down and all being dumped into this river down here, as well as the cities that are built down here. And that completely trashed the ecosystem at the bottom here at this lake, as well as depleting all of the floodplains on either side of the nutrients that they formerly had. So it was a very expensive project to straighten out this river, and it was equally expensive, possibly more expensive, when they went back and dug out the bends again to put the river back the way it was in the first place. I think that story just amuses me because it's like a Greek myth. There's such hubris to it. The idea that you would try to straighten out a river to try to make it behave, and that it would bite you back for it. Now, to close out this video, what will be a solution to habitat fragmentation? What are ways that we can actually help? Because I feel like in this class we talk a lot about environmental problems. If there's a solution, let's talk about a solution. So here's one clever solution that we've come up with, and they're called movement corridors. So let's say we have an area that's fragmented by a lot of roads. Up here you see some wolves. Wolves do not like coming near territories with a lot of human activity. They will avoid humans as much as possible unless they're in some sort of situation where they don't have much of a choice. They are out of food resources elsewhere, or they have such narrow habitat confines that they have no other option but to be near humans. The wolf population in some areas has been hunted nearly to depletion, or in some cases to depletion, because people that lived in that area were scared of the wolves, or they were eating their livestock, their sheep, something like that. And they said, "Oh, these wolves, they're bad. We're going to get rid of these wolves. Keep them away." That is one of the reasons why wolves will come near human areas, is if there are livestock available, easy prey for them to be able to peck off. So sometimes humans will hunt wolves to get them out of the area. But once the wolves were gone, all of the elk in these forests, they had no natural predators. So what happens when you remove a carnivore? The herbivores start increasing in number, and then the plant population, the producers, starts reducing. And those elk not only eat ground cover plants, but they'll also eat brand new tree saplings that are just starting to sprout up before they've really gotten all woody and tough. So the replacement of some of these larger trees, which are the main structure, the defining feature of this terrestrial ecosystem, they were starting to be reduced as a result of essentially getting rid of these wolves. So when they reintroduced the wolves, they still had this problem that the wolves kind of wanted to stay only where they were reintroduced, because they want to stay away from like the roads if they can help it. So they came up with this solution, which is movement corridors, which are natural looking bridges, kind of like these bridges from one part of the ecosystem to another part of the ecosystem, that allows fragmented portions of the landscape to be connected to each other, so that animals can move from one area to another area without having to interact with the human element. So if you think about those deer that are crossing the street when you're trying to drive on Pennsylvania roads at night, well, if they have the option to cross somewhere where they aren't going to have to interact with cars, which they are terrified of cars, that's one thing we all know about deer, and they know that that's something that's in their environment. They know that there's one place where they can cross from one area to another without having to deal with that terrifying experience. They will start using that. They will just start crossing there instead. So these more movement corridors allows them to use a larger area of their habitat. It allows the connection of these fragmented pieces and allows them to use it without having to move through the human matrix, or move safely through the human-dominated matrix in between those sections. And the more a population is dispersed, the healthier it's going to be, the larger it can grow, the more easily it's going to be able to track and deal with the elk populations that are distributed all over the place. It really helped the overall health and biodiversity of the forest. The elk population went down, and the diversity of plant species and the populations of the trees started recovering. So by reintroducing one species, the populations of many, many other species actually started to increase as well. Now, a large bridge is not super appropriate for every species that we're trying to maintain. Take a look at these butterflies down here. They rely on milkweed for their life cycle. This is a monarch butterfly. It pollinates milkweed. It gets its food from milkweed. It lays its eggs on milkweed. That's what they need. But the little patches of floral areas where the milkweed is, when they leave those little sections and they go out into the matrix, they honestly have no idea which direction to go to find another little section of milkweed for their next meal. So they're randomly selecting, almost randomly selecting which direction they're going to fly in, and hoping that they will catch whiff of another plant if they travel long enough in that direction. But they don't always. They frequently go to some little patch, pollinate it, and then they travel in some direction and end up dying after leaving that section. What would help them is if we increased the number of patches that existed, such that leaving any one patch in any direction, there would be a pretty good chance that they would find another patch of milkweed, no matter which direction they went in. And the way that we do that is we have people that will put out window boxes or milkweed plots in their garden. Even in urban areas, people will get little window boxes and plant milkweed in it. All of it to encourage the monarch butterflies to come to their window, and it looks very pretty. It's a nice mental health benefit for us, because milkweed is a cute pink flower, and having butterflies flapping around your window is just a lovely treat on any day. But also it means that the butterflies have a larger number of options, a larger number of patches that they can move to. And that is another way that we can help decrease the effect of habitat fragmentation for pollinator type species. I guess I should note here that monarch butterflies migrate seasonally. So there's a reason why they are traveling long distances. They have to move cover very large tracts of land, and they need these pit stops, these stopover points, in order to survive that journey.